So thank you so much for coming out on this night that seems to have scared a lot of people, even though, as we all say, we are not Atlanta.
That's true.
Give me a break. I grew up in Delaware, and it was very, the inch of snow. Everybody ran out and bought milk and eggs and bread, and did what with it for days on end. But, so I'm really glad I live here now where this doesn't get in the way. Thank you so much to the bookstore. I am published by a small publisher, which means I'm really dependent on independent bookstores, which is where I like to shop anyway.
Yes.
So it's kind of wonderful harmonic convergence there. So again, I really appreciate it, and especially all the events that you put on. I've been going to events like this for years, so it's very weird to be on the other side now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this book came to be, and I'm going to read the prologue and a little of the first chapter, and then answer some questions. First of all, I should explain, the publisher named it. He didn't like my name. Richard Ford's Canada had come out. This is a New York publisher, and I think he thought Montana. I like it because it sort of sets me up to do a series. The next one will be Dakota. And we're just going to keep going as long as somebody will keep publishing. But this is my first published novel. It's not my first novel, and I think an experience common to a lot of writers. I have a novel set in Wyoming, deep in a drawer. I don't quite have the nerve to toss it. It should be tossed. It should never, ever become public in any way. And I remember sending this out, or queries out to agents, and didn't even get responses. And when I look at it now, I go, well, no kidding. And then, through happenstance, my job sent me off to Afghanistan. The 9/11 attacks happened, and so Afghanistan, talk about your material, much of which was not pertinent to newspaper stories, but my God. So I came back and I thought, I'm going to write a novel set in Afghanistan, and it will be timely, and it will be interesting, and it will be about war. And I thought it was a lot better than the first one. I got an agent who thought it was good. She started shopping into New York publishers. I thought, this is going to be great. It wasn't great. Nobody bit. And so she called me after close to a year and said, so, how's that next book coming? And at that point, I had no next book. I was sitting back waiting for glory. Talk about your rookie mistake. When I finished this one, like literally the next day, started the next one. But I assured her I had started the next one, and started frantically looking through old short stories and stuff I'd thrown away. I never actually throw anything away, but I have a file called out, and everything I don't use goes in the out file. And I started going through the out file and found this fragment about a woman sitting on a hill looking down at her cabin as a bad guy goes through it. I thought, that I liked it. I liked it when I wrote it, but the reason I stopped writing was that was going to lead inevitably into a mystery novel. And I, at the time, did not read many mysteries, not familiar with the form, and just thought, I can't do that. But when I went, this was the only thing I had that really caught my interest. So I thought, well, I'll find out why she's up on that hill. And since clearly bad things are going to happen, I better populate this with some other people. And about a couple hundred pages in, I thought, okay, here we are in the middle of a mystery. I really don't know what I'm doing. And so I literally went to Google and typed how to write a mystery. Lots and lots of advice on Google. Little sample outlines. I don't outline. But actually some of it was fairly helpful, and what that did for me was talk about structure. And as a journalist, for almost 40 years, I had written long magazine stories and long projects, and structure is really important because you want to keep your reader interested. And that process, going back and thinking, okay, where's my framework, felt familiar enough that I had the confidence to keep going. And so that's what kind of got me into writing a mystery novel, sort of totally by accident. And now I read a lot of them, trying to get familiar fast, and have really, there are some beautifully written mysteries, and now when I read a novel that's really kind of literary and a little artsy, I'm like, yeah, something needs to happen. Where are we going? And then you read something like The Goldfinch, where something's happening every minute of 600 pages. So that kind of throws that back on me. Anyway, that's how this got started. That fragment that I found and started with is almost word for word the prologue. So I'm very grateful to these 3 pages. So like I said, I'm going to read these in a little bit of the first chapter. A stick snapping beneath a hard-soled boot sounds like nothing else in the woods. Mary Alice Carr spent much of the night on the slope above her cabin, wide-eyed and upright, back braced against a rolled sleeping bag, the minutes an inky ooze of boredom cut by fear, the hours flowing so slow and dreamlike that when the crack reverberated through the darkness, she wondered if she conjured it from the thin mountain air. Beside her, the young dog raised his head. She heard right then. The cabin stood against a rocky bluff on one of the rare level shelves where the northern Rockies break their headlong surge toward the sky, out of the path of the unremitting wind whose default force was a full-on gale. The wind's relentless onslaught scoured the land's surface, sculpting strange and brooding shapes out of the local limestone. It toughened the region's animal inhabitants into fierce and predatory opportunists, and caused the human ones, upon occasion, to burst into inexplicable tears. But at dawn the wind lay down, gathering strength for the day's battering siege. Here and there sounds rose up, sudden and distinct. Dry needles sifting from lodgepole pines, the coyote's trailing refrain, footfalls across the cabin's porch. The half-grown border collie vibrated low and tense beneath Mary Alice's hand. She closed her fingers around his muzzle and called herself 20 different kinds of stupid. Whoever was down there wasn't even trying to keep quiet. She felt for her cell phone, habit, useless. Her cabin sat at the far and unreliable border of the phone's coverage area. Her position up the hill fell well into the dead zone. Her fingers moved past the phone and fastened on the 45 with a snick as she thumbed off the safety, another alien noise in the pre-dawn hush. Mary Alice eased onto her stomach by centimeters. The slick fabric of her puffy down jacket made soft, whispery sounds as she set the gun in front of her, resting her wrist on a flat rock. She'd hauled the rock into place the night before, back when she'd attributed the whole elaborate setup to the paranoia resulting from working too long on a story turned too strange. It's never as bad as you think, her friend Lola liked to say, of everything from meals to men to the various stories they chased as young reporters in Baltimore. It's worse. Lola's plane would land in just a few hours. They hadn't seen one another in 5 years when Lola had gone off to Afghanistan and Mary Alice to Montana, career paths that had run parallel for years suddenly diverging. Lola had promised her some war stories when she arrived. Mary Alice closed her eyes and contemplated the fact that she'd have a war story of her own once this night was over. Cold pinched her exposed wrist. He'd been in the cabin a long time, probably at her desk, strewn with files baited with misleading labels, flash drives filled with meaningless junk. If she called it right, he'd scoop it all up, assume he'd gotten what he came for, and drive away, giving her a precious few seconds to glimpse his face before he got into his car. She wondered how long she should stay up on the hill after he left, then realized she'd never actually heard him drive up. She opened her eyes. Mist pooled in the clearing below, the darkness cottony around the edges, dawn commencing. He knelt on the porch, solid and dark and real in the vaporous light, sighting Mary Alice through the scope of an AR-15, its barrel steadied on the porch railing. A hat shielded his face, but she had no trouble imagining the crosshairs centered on her own. The sturdy 45, so comforting moments before, felt like a toy in her shaking hand. 50 yards was pushing the limits of its range. By the time her bullet slowed in a tumbling fall toward the porch, his would have punched through her and beyond, just getting warmed up on its unerring way. The dog began to bark. Mary Alice dropped the gun and raised her hands high. "Miss!" The voice rode the wavering lamplight so softly through the crack in the door that Lola Wicks sank back toward sleep, soothed by the customary noises in the next room. The endless gurgle of tea into cracked cups, breathy fricatives of pashto, the metallic ratchet of magazines locking into place in preparation for the coming day. Lola slid lower in her sleeping bag, inhaling the pleasurable scent of wood smoke and dung that signaled her most recent foray from Kabul into the highlands, entire centuries falling away the farther she traveled from the city, the only signs of modernity in these mountain villages, the terrible weapons hoisted by cloaked men in sandals. The conflict was close here, not like Kabul, where men postured around conference tables with the occasional anonymous grenade tossed through a window to keep things interesting. In the highlands, combatants knew one another's names. It had taken her months to gain the trust of this particular faction, whose stated purpose was to drive the Americans from Afghanistan's borders even more decisively than they dealt with the Russians 2 decades earlier. Despite the risks of leaving Kabul's questionable safety, any return to the outlying regions always felt like a sort of homecoming to Lola, a welcome respite from filing her stories in the crowded villa whose outlandish expense she shared with a shifting, quarreling cast of other foreign correspondents. Distractions and obligations peeled away as she traveled, until she arrived at a destination where filing the story and staying alive remained the only two things that mattered. Lola pulled the bag tighter around her head. It was mid-June, but nights still snapped with cold in these lower reaches of the Hindu Kush. Miss, the door opened wider. Her fixer again, his voice insistent. Lola sat up and reached for her headscarf, the only article of clothing she discarded at night. Even keeping her boots on, her laces merely loosened. Oh, she murmured, yes. A call, miss. He scooted her beeping satellite phone, freed from its generator recharge across the dirt floor. It came to a stop against the edge of a rug whose rich dyes and labyrinthine swirls mocked the Spartan surroundings. Lola cursed quietly in English. Not even the most publicity-hungry warlord would call her at this hour. It had to be an editor. She flipped open the phone without bothering to look at the numbers. Don't you people ever think about time zones, she asked, then sat up straighter. What, she said? You are not serious, she said, and cursed again, not bothering to whisper this time. So it was an editor, and he was calling to say, you need to come back to Baltimore right now, next plane, whatever, donkey to the plane. But you need to be back here. And he wisely waited until she was back in Baltimore before telling her that her job was over. They were closing all their foreign bureaus, but he wanted her to know that she was one of the lucky ones because she was going to get a job out in the suburbs, which is traditionally where you start your career. And as Lola said, interns cover that shit. And he said, well, yeah, we don't have interns anymore. You're going to have a paycheck. And she just pitched a fit in his office. And he was trying to calm her down. He said, you have weeks and weeks of vacation time you've never taken. You have to take them. Take the summer off, go out, visit that friend of yours in Montana, and come back a little calmer. And so she does. Her plan is she's going to go see her friend, but then hop a plane back to Kabul and write a story so magnificent that they'll be convinced to reopen the bureau and leave things alone. Yeah. Well, when she gets to Montana, her friend is not there at the airport as prearranged, and she calls her friend, no answer. Calls her friend, no answer. Calls and calls and calls until her friend's voicemail is full. And not being a patient person, she says, the hell with this. She decides to rent a car and drive up to her friend's town near the Canadian border. When she stops at the town, she asks directions, and as it's getting dark, she heads up to her friend's cabin. She slowed and scanned the west side of the road, looking for the opening they said would appear just past a big tree. Even so, she almost missed it. She stomped at the brake and backed up a few feet, turning onto a track of flattened grass that led through the scrub. Stars emerged, catching and concentrating the failing light. The little rental car labored up a hill, ragged fingernails of brush dragging along its sides. The track took a final turn and opened into a meadow. Lola cut the ignition. The cabin stood at the far side of the clearing, nearly invisible in the shadow of a bluff. To one side, tall pines sheltered a shed and small corral. A spotted horse moved restlessly back and forth, tossing his head. Lola got out of the car and inhaled the sharp, clean scent of evergreen. The trees sighed, their branches rubbing and reaching as the wind wandered through. Lola leaned against the cool stream of air and let it slide across her face, and resisted an inkling that she was glad she'd come. She headed for the cabin, keeping to the edges of the meadow, avoiding exposure out of habit, stepping carefully through the darkness beneath the trees. She didn't see the red pickup until she was nearly upon it. Lola flattened her hand against it. The metal was cold, its surface jeweled with dew. Mary Alice hadn't parked it moments before and rushed inside to get her things before racing back out to fetch Lola from the airport, full of apologies for being late. No, she had not. Lola looked at the truck a while. Maybe something was wrong with it. Maybe Mary Alice had caught a ride with someone else or borrowed a friend's car. Maybe she'd gotten halfway to the airport and then checked her cell phone and listened to Lola's messages and was speeding back, readying a lecture for Lola on the value of patience. Maybe, probably. A dog barked. Lola ducked behind the truck. She raised her head above the hood by degrees, scanning the forested hillside beyond the cabin. A shaggy black and white dog raised itself stiff-legged from the grass and whined. Lola dropped to her knees, knocked off balance by a flood of recall and its accompanying relief. Mary Alice had gotten a dog. She liked to hike with it, she'd written, so that's where she'd been. Hey, Mary Alice, Lola called into the woods. Your dog beat you back. The words rose on the wind and lost themselves amid the trees. Lola listened for an answering shout, for the sound of footsteps hurrying home. The wind settled. The silence that followed had weight and texture. Lola stood uncertain within it. The dog lay down across something heaped and shiny. It flattened its ears and sent a long, audible growl Lola's way when she took a step and then another toward it. Lola watched the ground, wary of losing her footing in the darkness. Halfway up the hill, she lifted her gaze. The shiny stuff was a jacket, and someone was in it. She forgot about her feet and sprinted, almost falling beside a rolled-up sleeping bag. Mary Alice's eyes stared upward, a fat fly quivering atop a pupil, despite the evening chill. Lola avoided their unwavering scrutiny and concentrated on the neat hole in Mary Alice's cheek, and remembered a time years earlier, when still new on the job, she held a ballpoint pen to a similar hole in a man's chest, thinking that its very insignificance, so small, so defined, made a good detail for the story she was writing. She hadn't known then, but she knew now, what the hole's counterpart looked like, and so when she put her hands to Mary Alice's head, she was careful just to touch fingertips to temples, and sure enough, when she lifted gently, not even an inch, there was nothing left back there, just a mess of congealed blood and brain and shattered bone, brocaded by long, long strands of bright golden hair. So, dum dum dum. Yeah. So Lola's not going back. Thank you. So I'm happy to answer questions about this.
How much time did you spend in Afghanistan?
Not as much as Lola did. About combined Pakistan and Afghanistan, I went twice in a month or a little more each time, maybe 5 weeks.
For?
For
Years.
Whom?
I'm sorry, the Denver Post at the time.
What year was that?
That was in 2001, right after we started bombing, and then a year later, 2002, on the anniversary of 9/11. So it's been a long time now. Yeah.
I have a question. What is the town of Magpie, Montana? I've been racking my brain.
A lot of people have asked me that, and I made up a town because I knew if I based it on a real one, I'd get something wrong.
Oh, okay.
So I have heard cut bank. Somebody else swears it's Valier. I'm not really that familiar with Valier, but now he's sure it's Valier. He said everything is where it should be. So I got to go check it out. But I needed it to be in a certain place, and no town was quite in that place, and I just made it.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Very powerful writing.
Oh,
Just
thank
wanted
you.
to say that's incredible.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and that was like what I gave the least amount of thought to, which makes me a little crazy. But thank you. Sometimes it's better, I think, not to overthink something.
Yeah.
How did you wind up with Missoula?
Oh God, I did what everybody does years
Follow
ago.
the guy?
Well, my brother, the second thing everybody does. I came out here backpacking with my brother on a trip to Glacier. And literally, I was living in Philadelphia at the time, and it was August, and a Philadelphia summer is hell on earth. And I got off the plane in Missoula, and it was cool and just clear, and got up to Glacier, and it snowed on us. I was like, I forgot to live here. So it took me a very long time to find a job here. But I finally did. I've not regretted it. I have a real talent for making my income go down, down, down. Montana fit right into that plan.
Because everyone in this
I'd like to pursue that just a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, how did you get to Missoula? How did you get to the Denver Post? And how did you get to conflict reporting? Was this your first conflict, or did you get bloodied before?
My first big one. I worked for many years for the Philadelphia Inquirer, back when journalism was journalism. And part of this book is my own kind of fury at what has happened to journalism. And I was a national correspondent for them. We had people all over the country, and I was based in Denver, and my job, I got paid for roaming the West from Montana all the way down to the Mexican border, and sometimes on either side of those borders, to just find stories of national interest. And so I kept going back and back to Montana to the point where my editor said, you know, Texas is part of your territory. You might want to go there. And I was like, no, might not. But while I was at the Inquirer, they sent me to Chiapas. That was probably as close as I almost got sent to Kosovo, and then peace broke out. I was really mad about that. And I had been at the Denver Post maybe 6 weeks when 9/11 happened, and they sent me and a number of other people to New York immediately. As soon as the planes flew again, we went to New York. And then I pitched going to Pakistan. And they sent me directly from New York to Pakistan, and then I said, we really need to go to Afghanistan, and for some reason, I don't understand, they did. So, and they sent, I went with a photographer, another reporter and photographer went to a different part, you know, so there were a number of us over there for a while. That was the deal.
Was it difficult getting in at that point?
Yeah, when I went, the US had just started bombing, and the only way, Kabul was still held by the Taliban. And the only way you could get in was to go through Tajikistan. First of all, you had to go to Berlin to get a visa from the Northern Alliance to the northern part of Afghanistan. So that was just a hoot.
And was that like a payola thing? You had to pay a lot of money? Or
Actually, for that I didn't. I've had to do that since. I would always write special fee on my expense accounts. But my visa was just like a little sheet of paper that they stapled into and a little stamp into my passport. And so from Tajikistan, we went over the Afghan border, which was a hoot in itself. There was a convoy of like 100 journalists, so we traveled all day, and we get to the, was it the Oxus? It was like, you know, this river that is so evocative. As night is falling, and you're hearing gunfire on the other side, it's, you know, there's a beautiful sunset, but it's like they're shooting over there. And you go on this raft that is powered by a tractor engine to get across the river. And then there's this mud hut. They take us all in this mud hut, and there are guns all over the walls. And they say, passport. And so we hand over our passport. And, oh, this is where they kill us. And they literally, this man sitting on a rug on the dirt, takes our passport, spreads them out, and goes, welcome to Afghanistan. And so that was the drill. And then we continued on to Kabul. And as we continued on, like a day before we got there, the Taliban left. So we came into Kabul the next day, and it was astounding because people had not seen Westerners for years, I mean, decades. And they crowded around easily 30 deep. I mean, there would just be these mobs if we stopped anywhere where people would come and just kind of stare at us. So it was quite an experience.
Wow.
Yeah. And I look back and think, well, that was stupid. At the time I was
But you'd do it again, right?
I'm not
No?
sure, actually. I think yeah, I decided I like my life. I like plumbing. I keep telling you, it was like the worst backpacking trip you can imagine. You know, usually when you're backpacking, you're in beautiful scenery and no one's trying to kill you.
You're not wearing a headscarf either.
No, and that's really good too, because that got annoying. But it was a good thing to do. So.
Where were you in Chiapas?
In San Cristobal. Yeah, were you?
Like 95?
No, it was 90, it was after the whole unpleasantness.
Okay.
But
So
things
I was living down there when it all broke out in
wow,
Tapachula, and I was
yeah.
like, should I be worried? And the director
Yeah.
of the school said, oh no, this happens every few years. So.
It was still pretty intense in
It was
parts,
pretty
like
intense.
we sneaked around a roadblock one night, which was not a cool thing to do.
Right.
And we went on tourist visas because they wouldn't let you in on a journalism visa, so we were always kind of, you know, they would stop us, and there sat a photographer draped with all his equipment, and they'd say, what are you doing? Tourist?
Bird watching.
Right, exactly. And, but realistically, it wasn't that bad, it was beautiful.
Yeah,
It was really
I
beautiful.
love it.
You get to Mazari, sorry,
Go ahead.
you get to Mazari Sharif?
I did not, and I really wanted to, because it was supposed to be beautiful. And
Did you
have you
Did you
been there?
travel with my friend Lawrence Sheets, who was then working for NPR?
No, I traveled with Steve Inskeep. People have such relationships with the NPR voices, like when he came into this room, we were all waiting for some kind of permission slip, and he said, I'm Steve Inskeep. Everybody went, Steve Inskeep. So, no, I would have loved to have gone there, though. But, as I said, don't think I'll be going back. And I was really lucky. At the time, there was not the embedding program that they have now, and that may be winding down, so I was able to not be stuck, I don't want to say stuck with the troops, but that my interest was in the Afghan people and what their lives had been like and what they were going to be like now. So we did not have that military kind of curtailment that we would have had otherwise. You could just sort of wander around like idiots.
Well, speaking of war zones, how's your publishing experience been?
Oh my God. It's tough, you know, it's really tough. As I said, I'm with a small publisher, and that has its own rewards. I have a ton of contacts, Scott will tell you. They're on the phone with me easily every week, if not every few days. So you get that kind of attention. But, you know, I have to do all my own publicity and marketing and stuff like that for the large part. On the other hand, I like the books they publish a lot, so I'm glad to be in with that group of people.
Good.
Yeah.
Are you sticking with them for your next book?
Yeah, it was a 2-book deal, so I had to, and I use the word, you know, deal very loosely, but it was a 2-book contract, so. But it has worked out very well so far. I'm
Good,
really
I'm
happy
glad
with
to
it.
hear that.
Yeah. But, you know, after that, all bets are off, and then we'll see.
What's after Dakota?
Wyoming.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, yeah, and that movie Nebraska, I was like, damn it, you know, I gotta stay away from the Midwest for a while. Did anyone see it? It's a really good movie. And Billings, in the opening scene. Oh, yeah.
So is there one thing that ruined journalism, or just is it Google or the internet, or?
You know, probably nobody figured out early on how to make money from the internet. They instantly gave away content for free. And now I think they're just flailing. They don't know what to do other than to keep cutting bodies. And I think that is a great way to, you know, enhance, to make your product worse and worse and worse and charge more and more and more for it. There's a business model.
Working for the post office.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. That is a frighteningly apt analogy, but it's really discouraging. It makes me a little crazy when I think about it. The Washington Post, the good news is that Amazon, that ruiner of publishers, is pouring a ton of money into the Post and hiring a lot of new reporters. Maybe they'll figure it out. So, who knows?
Any other questions? Well, thank you so
Wow,
much.
thank
Gwen.
you.
Thank you.
Gotcha.